Hello, how are you doing? It is quite grey and drizzly outside in London today, so I thought I'd film here in my library. But there is the sunny and exciting news that the shortlist for the 2021 Booker Prize has just been announced, and these are the six novels. Now, if you watched my video last week making predictions about what would be on this shortlist, you'll know that I got four out of these six correct, and that was more like a wish list of mine. So overall, I'm really happy with this list. There's a couple of the books which I have slight issues with, but I'll get into that when I start talking about the books, because I know for some people they only really start following this prize each year when the shortlist is announced. And so I'm going to go through and give summaries and my thoughts and feelings about each of these novels and the thoughts and feelings I've had since reading them, because I have read all of these novels, so I do have opinions about them. But I'd love to know which you're interested in reading, if you're going to give yourself the challenge of reading all six novels before the winner is announced on November 3rd, or if you're just going to pick and choose the ones you're most interested in, or if you've already read all the books and you have opinions about the shortlist. Let me know about those below. But first off, giving a sort of breakdown of the list as a whole, I mean, it's quite interesting. They're all quite different styles of writing and different subject matter. I mean, a couple of the books like The Fortune Men and Great Circle deal with specific historical periods of time. Other books like The Promise and A Passage North deal with specific political incidents in certain countries, and but each novel like uses a really different style. And you know, the Booker Prize is always purporting that they promote books which are sort of pushing forward the form of the novel. And I think a lot stylistically, a lot of these novels do really interesting things, and there's a lot to talk about. I mean, even some of the more traditionally structured novels, you could say maybe like The Fortune Men and Great Circle, I think are doing really interesting things with their narrative. But just looking at a breakdown of the authors, and so there's one debut novel on the list, although Patricia Lockwood, she's not new to publishing. She's published poetry before and a much acclaimed memoir, but this is her first novel. There is also three female authors and three male authors on the list, which wasn't what I was expecting from the long list, as I talked about in my previous video. I'm just based on the books that were long-listed for the prize. I wasn't expecting that, but it's always nice to see a balance in gender of the authors, so that's really good. But when it gets to nationality, it's really interesting. So there's one author from Sri Lanka, there is one author from South Africa, there is one author that is British Somali, and then there are three Americans. And I know this is going to be a thing that some people talk about, and that has been talked about the prize ever since they allowed American novelists to enter the prize, that Americans tend to start dominating the lists of the prize. And I've always felt very ambivalent about this rule as well. But also I have to say, I think these are really great novels. And although, you know, I have slight issues with Patricia Lockwood's novel, but they handle like really different subject matter, and each of them use very different styles. Although an interesting parallel you could say between Bewilderment and No One Is Talking About This is that these are definitely novels that are created in the shadow of Trump's presidency. I mean, in No One Is Talking About This, there's a political leader only referred to as the dictator that makes policy, tries to introduce new policy decisions about women's reproductive rights. And then in Bewilderment, there is a populist leader who questions the results of a democratic election and who has very definite negative policies about the environment, and who introduces suspicion about the validity of the media. And so yeah, that's a striking thing about those novels as well. But I'm gonna get down into each of the novels and give short summaries of them and how I feel about them. First off, I'm gonna go in reverse alphabetical order by author surname, just to just for fun. And so first off, there's Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead, which is a great big epic novel. This is the longest novel on the long list. It's 600 pages long, although originally the manuscript version of this novel was 1,000 pages long. So she cut down quite a lot of it to create this novel, which is a dual storyline taking place in two different time periods. One is the story of Marion, who is an aspiring pilot, and we follow her journey from childhood, well, actually from her parents' lives, then through her childhood, through her development, her involvement in the war, and then her aspirations to fly around the globe from pole to pole, rather than around the equator. And she mysteriously disappeared during that journey, that ambitious voyage. And then we get the story of Hadley in the present day, who's a Hollywood starlet that has become famous for starring in a number of teen films and wants to make a biographical movie about Marion and her life, because she has had a very special influence on this actress's life and on her development, and now she's trying to reconnect with this personality that she was first introduced to in her childhood when she read her memoir. And so we get both of these stories, and through going backwards and forwards in time, we get little pieces about the past and gradually learn what happened to Marion. And so it's quite a suspenseful story in that way, but also a really epic, sweeping book looking at long periods of time in history and changes in the culture and society and issues to do with sexuality and gender. And there's lots of engaging, exciting events that happen in the novel that kept me gripped all the way through. I mean, I absolutely didn't mind the page length of this novel, and I would be really curious to read those additional 400 pages to see what else was in there. I mean, it's probably for the best that it was cut, but it would be just sort of interesting in a scholarly way to learn about what didn't make the cut. Now, the criticism has been made because there is so much scandal in this book that you could say it's somewhat melodramatic, but I absolutely didn't mind that. I really enjoyed that aspect of it, and I just found it so engaging and such a pleasure to read. Bewilderment by Richard Powers. This is the only novel on the shortlist which hasn't been published yet, which I know a lot of people have been frustrated about, but you don't have long to wait because it is due to be published in the UK and the US on September 21st, so only a week from now. I don't know about other territories yet, but this is a story which takes place in the near future and involves a man named Theo, who's an astrobiologist who looks at distant planets and distant galaxies and tries to speculate on the environmental conditions and the possibility of life that might form under those conditions. And it's also about his son Robin, or Robbie, who is a very clever and passionate boy, but has some difficulties, social difficulties, and he's having trouble at school, and his school and teachers want to medicate him, and his father's really against that. So he finds some alternative therapy for Robbie, and also tries to find his own ways of dealing with this by taking Robbie out into nature. And so they spend time camping out in the woods and connecting with nature in that way, because Robbie really cares about the environment and loves the environment and is very passionate and worried about climate change, as he should be. And the father sort of reasonably decides, like, well, it's quite reasonable that he's anxious a lot of the time because there's a lot to be anxious about, and that's a real clear message that's driven through in this novel. But also during these trips, sometimes when Robbie is having one of his episodes, his father will imaginatively take him to another planet to try to view these life forms that he speculates might be existing on these other planets. So there are sections of this book that are almost sort of sci-fi in that way, of the father and the son exploring these planets, which is quite imaginative and fun, but also really moving in when he shows them, because you know the real reason why the father is doing this with his son. And they have a lot of intense and moving dialogue with each other. I mean, I think it's so beautiful, the conversations they have and the honesty they have, and the real love and care and affection that you can read between them in this dialogue. I think it's so well written. And so it follows events over the course of the year as Robbie is seeking this new treatment, and amidst this new treatment they have to deal with the painful feelings of grief for the loss of Theo's wife and Robbie's mother, who died fairly recently. And so it's about them dealing with that grief, but also learning how to adjust in the world, and what it means to be politically active and politically engaged and a socially conscious person in the world today. And it is such a moving and powerful novel that I just think this book is incredible. The Fortune Men by Nadifa Mohamed. And as I mentioned, this is a novel about a real-life historical incident and a real historical figure named Mahmoud, who was a Somali-born merchant seaman that traveled to Wales eventually, and sort of settled down in Wales, where he got married and had children. And this was in the 1950s. And during that time, there was a murder in the local community of a merchant, and Mahmoud was falsely accused of this murder and was tried and executed for it. And this was a real historical incident, but there was overwhelming evidence that he didn't commit this crime. And so Nadifa Mohamed tells his story and the story of this community, not only going into his life, but of the people around him, who come from very different communities. So there's also a large Jewish community in this neighborhood, and she goes into their perspectives as well. And she shows how these different communities are living alongside each other and functioning within this larger society, where they live under certain constraints. And the way she writes about Mahmoud's experience is so intense and meaningful. The many instances of racism that he just has to accept as everyday occurrences, and which there's no recourse for, that he can't complain about, and how this physically changes him. Like he physically sort of hunches and shrinks, and his stomach shrinks, and how she describes that is so vivid and meaningful. And I've heard criticism of this book that, oh, you know how it's gonna end up, but you could say that about any historical novel. And somebody pointed out to me, like, well, you could make that criticism of Hilary Mantel's trilogy, that we know what happens to Thomas Cromwell, but we still, or at least I read those novels and were engaged all the way through, because of the way Hilary Mantel vividly brought this person from history to life and used it as a way of saying something about our present. And that's something Nadifa Mohamed absolutely does in this novel as well, and to really powerful effect. The way she delves into the community and the way individuals work within this community, and then into Mahmoud's personal past, his development, and the reason why he moved and settled down there, is so moving. And there's the stark fact of the injustice which occurred that has no justification other than blatant racism, and there's no question about that. And it's really interesting how she explores that the repercussions of this must still be felt today in the United Kingdom, and how that plays out. And I think it's really striking how she portrays that he's definitely not a saint. I mean, he was a gambler and a petty thief, but he was not a murderer. And she really shows that, like everyone else, he aspires to greater things in his life, but he encounters problems and troubles, and he makes some wrong decisions, and it's so tragic how he ultimately believed that the system would see that this is who he was, but the system only chose to see the color of his skin and his accent and where he came from. And that is the message she drives through so clearly and powerfully. And so I think this is a great novel. I mean, I had some issues with it towards the end of the novel, the way she shows the court case, and I felt like the novel sort of dragged a bit for me then, and that might just be my own particular taste. I feel like reading about court cases is usually like quite dry, but it did really drive home the overall message of this book. No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood, which was also shortlisted for the Women's Prize, as you can see on the sticker now. So I mean, it's incredible that this novel has been so acclaimed, and I sort of feel like I've been made sort of to be in opposition to this novel because it has been getting so much prize attention, and I just sort of thought it was all right when I initially read it. But actually going back and reading my thoughts about it before, like actually there was a lot that I got out of this novel. So it's about a woman that is famous for being on the internet, and in the first part of the book we get her experience in life on the internet, which is told in fragments, almost you could say in like Twitter speak, in these very short sections where you get this impressionistic idea of this woman's life and her existence sort of traveling around the world and talking about the internet and also her interactions with people online, but you don't get a full picture of her life. So her writing feels somewhat similar to Jenny Offel's work and how she portrays her characters' lives, but so it is quite like funny and really engaging in this way if you know the references she's making, because she makes a lot of specific references to memes or themes that like occur on Twitter. And you know, I'm someone that is online quite a lot, but not all the time, and so I feel like half the time when I'm on Twitter I'm sort of missing the jokes that are being made, and I felt the same way about the first section of this book. I felt like half the time I didn't really know the references she was making, and so wasn't really in on the joke or wasn't really understanding what she was talking about, and so that's, I think, a big issue with this novel. It makes me really wonder, like, how is this novel going to be read and received years from now? I mean, I think it's fascinating that this whole like language has occurred and arisen because of social media, and so I think that is worth memorializing. But as a novel experience, like, I wonder how important that will be and what resonance that will have for people in time to come, and also for people, you know, who don't spend any time online and don't probably know what she's talking about through a lot of this novel. And I almost want to ask some of the judges for the prize, like, did you get all the references made in this novel? Do you understand what she was talking about? And maybe that's not the point. Maybe you don't need to. You can just appreciate the language on the surface for what it's doing, because the internet has caused us to change the way we use language and communicate with each other in this way, that I think you can appreciate this about this novel. But also in the second part of this novel, when she goes into a more real life instance where a niece of hers is born with severe defects, and her family is trying to deal with this, and she is trying to deal with this reality and the impediment she faces, the limitations she has for dealing with this, because her sensibility has been so shaped by the internet in this way that she almost doesn't know how to deal with it, and is still sometimes trying to make jokes or trying to like communicate her emotions through. And it does come through some ways, but not as strongly as I wanted to. I mean, I know that really worked for some other readers, but it didn't quite work for me. I mean, there are some moments in the second part of the book which are incredibly moving, and especially when there's an instance to do with, I think, a brother that makes a sort of faux pas by he like misspeaks something when they're all together at a certain event, and it creates this real beautiful, touching human moment shared between them, which you can't have that sort of experience online. And so yeah, I thought that was really moving and striking. And actually, out of all the books on this shortlist, this is the one I'd really like to reread and revisit. And I think it's like worth noting that all of the judges will be rereading these novels, and so probably experiencing them a second time, you'll see different things and get different things out of them from reading them. And I certainly know I would. So yeah, it's I have complicated feelings about this book, but I'd be curious to know if other people are put off by the sort of sound of it, because I have seen some responses from readers who expected to hate this and really weren't interested in the subject matter, but ended up feeling really engaged by it. So it's going to be one much up for debate this year. The Promise by Damon Galgut. This novel follows the story of a white South African family in the years before and after apartheid, and follows their story in a very original way. I think the style of this novel is the most striking out of all of the books. It is so unique, how he delves into and out of certain characters' perspectives over the course of the novel, and really moves freely about. But you realize as you're reading along that there are restrictions on what you can see in the perspectives of these characters, because you learn that you are locked into this very white, prejudiced perspective, because there are a lot of racist opinions made by some of these characters, and it can be quite uncomfortable reading in that way. But then you realize that is the point, that is what Damon Galgut is trying to portray, that these individuals literally can't leave this perspective that they've been raised under and socialized into believing is the natural course. And so the main drama of this novel is that at the very beginning of the novel, a black servant of this family, Salome, she's promised a building on the location of this farm that they live on, to own it herself. But over the years, as we follow this family, not through their lives, but through a number of their deaths, and it's quite tense, wondering like who is going to go next. But this transfer is never made, and she's never given this property, so the promise is not fulfilled. And so it's about that question and the consequences of that. And I think it's really striking that the characters are really sympathetic in a lot of the ways. I mean, I grew to like them, and they have aspects of their personality. They have artistic aspirations. One of them wants to be a writer. Another one is very insecure about her body, and has a number of relationships with men. And then also there's the figure of Amor, who's the youngest daughter of the family, who wants this promise to be fulfilled. And when she realizes the situation she's living in and the country she's living in, she tries to remove herself as much as possible from this family and this way of life. And you're reminded the entire time that this family is really poisoned with this point of view which they can't escape. And I think it's so powerful the way that Galgut portrays that in this novel, and makes it an incredibly original book. And finally, there's A Passage North by Anuk Arudpragasam. Now, I feel quite bad that when the long list for this was announced, I had a lot of critical opinions about this novel, but I do think it's a very powerful book that is incredibly thoughtful. I found it so engaging, but because of the structure of the story, like, I know it's not going to be a novel for everyone, because it's not necessarily plot driven. So it follows the story of Krishan, who's a young man who's recently returned and moved back to his native Sri Lanka, and is reconnecting with his grandmother and his mother there, and he learns that his grandmother's former carer, a woman named Rainey, has recently died, and so he travels up to her funeral and to visit her. And so he is someone that has not experienced the effects of the recent civil war in Sri Lanka and the genocide of the Tamil people, who he is descended from, and a lot of the novel is him grappling with how to reconcile the knowledge of what happened with the reality of what he actually experiences and what he can do going forward, and that's so movingly portrayed. And this is a very thoughtful novel. You get lots of extended meditations of his, not only about these specific historical incidents and things to do with Sri Lankan nationality, but to do with larger philosophical questions, to do just with life and time and the nature of being. And the way he explores that is very moving and effective. I think there are certain trains of thought which work better than others, but overall it's a really like engaging way to think about a whole number of issues. Like there's a very striking scene where he sees a man on public transport and their eyes sort of lock in this way, and there's this like question to do with masculinity and how we relate to strangers in this way that I thought was really interestingly explored. But then there are other sections which I don't think do work quite as well. And I think where this novel really came to life for me the most was in the scenes depicting his grandmother Apama and her carer Rainey, on their sort of flashback scenes to their interactions with each other, and then his present day interactions with his grandmother, which I think are really moving and really touching, the way the affection between them and the sort of awkward interactions they have. And it's really striking the question, because Rainey is a survivor of the Civil War and experienced immense loss, and so is really struggling with the trauma of that, and the central character, like, he feels real sympathy to that, and because he's only witnessed these events from a distance, and just seeing like videos on his phone and that were posted on social media, and it's this question of where does our empathy begin and end when we experience these things, from a distance like that. And actually, that's something that's really interestingly explored in No One Is Talking About This as well. This question of viewing things online and the distance we have from that, or the way that arouses emotions in us. But then at the same time, we might flip to something else online, and in that might be more humorous, and then we're laughing, and so we experience this sort of ping pong of emotions when we're viewing things from a distance like that. And the way he explores this in this novel, I think, is so powerful. But on the whole, I do have to say I wish there were more scenes like that showing the actual character interactions than him just sort of smoking and looking into the distance and having these long meditative thoughts. So those are the 6 novels, and I have to say, like, a really interesting group overall, and a lot to say about them. And it will be really interesting if I have the time and patience to revisit Patricia Lockwood's novel. And also, I think Damon Galgut's novel definitely deserves a rereading, because I'm sure, you would get a lot more out of revisiting it, and Bewilderment. And so I mean, I wish I had limitless time to be able to read and reread books, like if I were a Booker judge. But those are my thoughts on all of the novels. But I'd like to know if you're interested in reading some or all of these books, or if you've read all of them, what your thoughts about the shortlist are, and let me know about those in the comments below, and we can have a chat about them. I'm sure we'll have lots of chat over the next couple of months. I think this is always the most exciting time, to have lots of debate and interrogation of the books and question about them, and seeing it from all different points of view, because each reader brings their own experience to a novel that they read. But thank you for watching, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye bye.